Welcome back to Demystify Sci. I'm Shiloh.
I'm Anastasia.
Today we are talking about revisionism of history through the lens of Christianity, which is a very bizarre topic for an ostensibly scientific podcast. But this is important. Hold on for a second. So, what's really fascinating about our guest today, who is Robyn Faith Walsh, a professor in religious studies at the University of Miami, is that she approaches biblical scholarship through the lens of the classics. In other words, she has an almost anthropological view on the inception of Christianity, which takes into account the context under which Christianity was formed. Now, that moment where Christianity becomes the dominant form of religion and sort of sweeps like wildfire across the globe is really fascinating because regardless of your own personal religious beliefs, something interesting happened back there where Rome went from this pagan society to this monotheistic tradition, and it became the state religion in a matter of a couple hundred years. Few hundred years.
And this links in many ways to the practice of science, which is a way of telling stories about nature that begins as an esoteric group of intellectuals that decide that this is how they're going to engage with the world, and then becomes the dominant paradigm that people now talk about having faith in.
And it becomes it becomes a religious paradigm that requires defense, right? There's institutional immunity against anything that challenges it at some point. And that's very religious. And science has a very religious tone in the mainstream in the way that people trust it, believe in it, stand behind it, attack people who are in any ways threatening that standard story. We see the same thing in Christianity, right? So this conversation is really important for understanding the way that humans behave and the way that we rally around certain ideas and don't tolerate dissent to them. And why is that? And how did this happen? And so really cool conversation, really different from what we do on the show, but also very conserved at the same time.
And I think that it's an interesting lead into what I can imagine having future conversations about, which is how a set of beliefs that ostensibly is about kindness and taking care of each other and being obligated to a universe that is larger than you becomes something that is really violent, right? You have the Crusades at some point, and we haven't really dived into that. But I think that what we're doing for ourselves is we're coming up with a cohesive story that can be told about the inception, the role that it plays at the beginning, and then future conversations will be about what happens to take it away from these really progressive, anti-imperial principles to being something that is all about empire, because that's a crazy transition that we have not even begun to scratch.
It really plays into the cycles of civilization idea, and that rears its head today, but it keeps coming up. And there's clearly cycles of understanding the universe as well. I don't know, cycles of science, Actually, this is one of the first things when I was a little kid, when I read this intro to Eric Lerner's book, The Big Bang Never Happened. It was really, really profound to me because he talks about how this happens, where people go through swing between complete supernaturalism and rationalism, and it's predictable in a way. And so there's something just deeply meaningful about the cyclicity to the way that our societies operate, how we get sick of things. We literally fill up on one way of being and it becomes corrupted and intolerable. And bureaucracies have the same cycle, right? There's something to this where we have to collapse into something new continually. So anyways, I think you guys are going to absolutely love this conversation.
And if you do love the conversation, consider coming over to patreon.com/demystifysci. We operate exclusively on donations from the audience, and this is a very important choice for us, because what happens when you run a project like this is that it takes a lot of time and it takes some money, right? Like, we have to be able to feed ourselves, we have to be able to get equipment, we need to hire stuff out.
Our house's roof is failing.
Yeah. We're not going to make it through the winter without a disaster. But we don't want to take advertisements. We really firmly believe in the idea that when you make something that's useful for people, the people who enjoy it will support it because they see that there is value in the world and they don't want you to have to sell stuff as the ticket to be able to survive doing it. And so if you like what we do and you have a couple of dollars to spare, consider coming over. We have a fantastic crew of patrons already, and we meet with them once a week, which is one of my favorite things because it's just an opportunity for everybody to connect and to talk about the ideas that are bothering them and that they're trying to figure out. And there's a community of people that are supportive and curious and really engaged with trying to figure out nature. And so if you become a patron, you can become a part of that community and help us build what we hope will be a very, very long-term project.
And if you really hate Patreon for ideological reasons, whatever reasons, we have a donation link down below. You also have the opportunity to use Super Thanks on YouTube now, so you can just give one-off donations very easily in the comments section. And you could maybe pick up a t-shirt down below. We're actually not making money off these t-shirts, but we're going to be rolling out some new ones soon too. And the idea is, it'll be a good conversation starter. Maybe you can share the podcast with someone. And that's a really great way to support us too, is just spreading the word, because, nobody's going to do it for us. It's just you guys who are sharing this. And that's the only way we grow. That's the way that we reach new people, that we get into new conversations, and we grow as people ultimately.
And if you can't do any of that, leave a comment, subscribe, share the podcast with a friend, come find us on Twitter, Facebook, or Discord, and just start talking to people who are already listening to the podcast. That's pretty much just as good as anything else.
For all of those who are already doing all these things, thank you so much. For the rest of you, think about it. And in the meantime, enjoy our conversation. Tell us your thoughts down in the comments. We'll see you guys next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
Let us see in the dark.
Does YouTube have an anti-phallic policy?
Probably. I know that they're anti-nipple.
We would find out.
No nipples for sure, but phalluses, maybe.
I remember back in the day when we did YouTube thumbnails, we tried to put classical paintings on them. And occasionally in classical paintings, there's a nipple. And the algorithm would immediately demonetize the video and be like, you can't do that. And I was just...
It's high art, come on. What's wrong with
this feels unfair.
I went off Facebook for a long time. I mean, I do anyway, but because I posted some Renaissance art and they were like little cherubs, with the wings, like the little fat babies, and they flagged it for child porn.
Wow. Yeah, it's like, this is why the AI takeover probably is still a long ways away.
And I did the thing do you want to debate this, or whatever it is, do you want
to appeal the ruling?
Yeah, exactly. And I was like, because they freezed me for a while, and I was like, yes, it's art, appeal the rule, it's a painting, with little angels. It's just and it's a butt, it's not anything. And the AI still rejected it. So
they're appeal denied, those people were freaks, we know what they were into.
Exactly. So you reposted it. We're going to censor our, censorship. So you're out. And I was like, all right, that's it. I was already done with this app, but now I'm definitely done with it.
It's funny because it's not that far off from what we wanted to talk about today, which is interpretations of works, right? I mean, and fundamentally what the Facebook computer is doing is misinterpreting what you've put there, right? And yes. That's at the heart of everything we do on this show too. I mean, we come at it usually from a scientific background, where obviously we have backgrounds in scientific research, but so much of the fascination for us stems in the past with the way that certain ideas get folded into the future of new ideas, and how that game of telephone really changes the way that we view the world over time. And it's kind of, we've talked about the Bible a few times on this show. I mean, we've talked to a few different people, but we're primarily interested in how these foundational texts have shaped modernity, and what's so fascinating about your work. And it seems like, if I can just lay your theory out in a sentence or something, you basically think that the Gospels are not primarily a religious work. There's something more, what's the word? secular about them, something more academic about them, something more tied into the state and to the elite culture at the time. And that's really fascinating to us, because I think that it would be hard for somebody to, like, people can say they don't like the Bible, they don't like Christianity, it's done all this terrible stuff. Okay, fair enough. But you can't deny that it's an important piece of our Western tradition. It's an important work, right?
You can't escape it.
Can't get away from that.
Exactly. Yeah,
so,
exactly.
For all the things people hate about it, there's something that we have to make peace with.
You have to contend with it. Yeah, exactly. That's why I do what I do.
So I'm like really stoked to unpack that. And it might be really interesting just to figure out why in the world you chose that problem out of so many others. Like, why'd you get into this? Why'd you start wondering about the Gospels?
Well, I started out as someone interested in classics. And that was really, I mean, the full story. And of course, everybody has a way that they create their own biography. So I try to be really clear about exactly what happened here, which is I went to college. I didn't want to learn another language where I had to sit in those situations where you have like your fake name and you have you have to play act like ordering dinner. You know what I mean? Like, I'd have to do that in French class or Spanish class. Like, you'd have to play act scenarios and that kind of thing. And I was just tired of having to learn another language where I had to verbalize it. And so, well, with Greek, it would be kind of interesting to learn an ancient language, a whole different alphabet, and also I won't have to speak it. I might have to read it out loud, but there's going to be that whole element of like the fake scenarios would be removed. I wouldn't be focusing on pronunciation, for example.
It wouldn't be a cheesy process.
Yeah. I wouldn't be annoyed and embarrassed by it. Right? Which I had felt in the past with some of these exercises you'd have to do in the classroom. And I just thought I was being clever because I was removing one less thing I have to do to learn another language. So I took the Greek class, and then it turns out I really loved it. There was something, I thought I wanted to go into a STEM field, and there was something I had convinced myself if I learned Latin or Greek, it would help me with my MCATs. And but then when I went into it, there was something almost like doing math problems, trying to figure out, like I taught myself Greek, through this class in a way where I really focused on like the shape of letters and understanding endings and patterns. And I treated it more like logic than a language that you would learn in the way that I just described in another scenario. So I learned Greek. I went through that curriculum, and there were relatively few people who would go on after like intro. So by the time I reached my senior year, I had taken everything that they had to offer. And there was like me and one other kid in a seminar. Like there were like two of us, right? Like in the senior seminar who had survived. It was like some kind of game show. So somebody recommended to me that I should read the New Testament because like here was a whole category of literature I hadn't even looked at. I'd been translating the Medea and Plato and, philosophers and other kinds of literature. So I, in my senior year, started to do an independent study where I read New Testament Greek with the New Testament professor on campus. And I started to realize none of the translations that I've ever encountered in English make any kind of sense. Because what's going on when biblical Greek is translated is, you'll even see this in the way the field is set up. You'll have a dictionary for New Testament Greek and a dictionary for everything else, even though these texts have been created at the same exact time. And even though the New Testament words are the same words you're going to find in Plato or the Stoics or in Homer, right? I mean, with a change because Koine Greek has like some different endings, like, different dialect basically. But these are the same words. And so you would actually have people say like, well, here's the New Testament definition versus the definition you're going to find everywhere else.
How did that get set up?
Because theologians were translating these things typically in the field. The critical study of the Bible was usually other, people from a faith-based perspective. There were some exceptions to this, but, that's what was dominating the landscape. the academic landscape. And so it seemed inconceivable. Like, I'll give you an example from something I'm writing right now. There's this text in the 2nd, 3rd century that's about a resurrected god, Homeric god, and this guy who's kind of like the caretaker of his temple cult, who runs into this guy who gets lost, and he tries to convince him that this guy is a god, and, you know, here's his story, and here's some other fantastic things that you should believe in. And over the course of the story, the guy eventually gets faith in what this resurrected god was claiming. So this comes out like 100 years after New Testament texts are already floating around in the ether. But if you read any introduction to the text, if you look at definitions of how people translate a word like faith, I haven't found an exception to this yet. Classicists will say, yeah, this sounds like a Christian narrative, a resurrected God trying to get, instill faith in a believer, right? But it can't possibly be, because faith has to mean something different. So yeah, we recognize that there are parallels here, but they can't mean anything. And then they move on. And they just say faith has to have a different definition, even though it's the same exact word in Greek. So it's that kind of thing that I ended up realizing, if I want a career, there is so much work to do because apparently, there's just been this conceptual divide between classicists and people who study the Bible that they haven't been able to fully bridge. And so they think everything that has to do with the New Testament is automatically Christian, even if Christianity didn't exist yet and it was still a Jewish movement. Even words can't mean the same thing. Everything has to be religious, and it could only be seen in that frame. But coming at it from somebody who was not, my framework wasn't one that had been informed by the way I was raised, meaning I could come to this text in Greek and it was kind of fresh for me in a way that it might not be for someone. I mean, I went to church growing up because I had to, right? Because I grew up in that context, but I was like too flighty. And I was like, I remember taking CCD and not understanding what was going on. And like, it just didn't connect for me for whatever reason. The theology never connected for me, or it never
CCD?
quite made sense. CCD is when you are raised Catholic. If you don't go to a religious school on Sundays, you would be sent to school to get religious education in order to be what they call confirmed into the faith. So you would have to, as like a young person, like a teenager, say like 12, 13, first you would have First Communion, which was one of the sacraments, and then you would get confirmed later on when it was thought that you had the autonomy to consent.
I had to go through all this in the Lutheran Church too.
So you know exactly what, yeah. So I would.
But I also was just kind of, it just seemed like, I don't know, there's this weird blurring of fairy tales and faith, and It was very bizarre for me. It's mostly just a chance to hang out with other kids for me.
Soviet Jew, so I went to synagogue like once a year, every 2 years, 3 years.
Well, I can remember the moment that I see as a pivot point for me. And again, I know I'm narrativizing this, but the fact that I remember this, I think is like shows that it never left me, which was I did go to Catholic school later on, and I had this Sister Yvette, who I still talk to sometimes actually. And she taught like our religious hour, like whatever you call it, like the block, right? I think I was in 7th grade. And she had like this moment where she was talking to herself, where she freaked out. I don't know how else to put it, because she was saying to us, Jesus wasn't white. Like, she had this moment because we were working on these workbooks with like the typical picture of Jesus and like the robes and the long hair, like the white guy that looks like he was in Star Wars, right? And she just had this moment, and she's like, he's from basically Palestine, right? He's from Judea. He's not a white guy. I don't know why your textbook does this, because this is not what this guy looked like. And she just like had this moment that was like above the heads of 7th graders, especially like in the 90s. But she had this like freak out about this to herself. And I think what caught my attention was mostly like, what was that? Like, here's this otherwise very kind of placid person who had like this break for a moment. And then I remember thinking to myself, well, if that's not true, what are we doing? Like, you're right. What are we doing? Like, what are we doing here? but I didn't have the cognition and the maturity at that time to do anything with that information. But it was one of those things, like as a child, that makes an impression, and then you spend the rest of your life like having that flash, like in the grocery store, where you're like, what was that? What was that about? And so once I started reading this text in Greek, realizing that it had this entirely idiosyncratic approach, and then coupling that with this lifetime of experience of, why do you think that? What are we doing? What is that? It just kind of brought all of that together for me. So I went into the field because I just realized I loved it. I loved the intellectual level of engagement. I loved that there were so many problems to solve. I loved the creativity involved in it. I don't think I would have been a good physician because I'm not great at STEM field stuff. The reason I wanted to be a physician is because that's everybody in my family is in the medical field except for me. But also I thought I would have a creative mind around things like diagnoses. So I thought I would want to be something like a radiologist. And I thought if I could just get through the STEM part, then I thought I had like a flexible enough mind to maybe make a contribution. But I knew I had to get through those other hoops. But then I realized here's a place where I can exercise some of those same ideas about discipline in terms of like engaging text and reading ancient materials and thinking about definition and doing comparative work, and then drawing it into, as you pointed out, like a larger scheme of how does interpretation work, and then couple that with how much these texts have had influence in law and ethics and ideas of morality, especially in this country. And people don't even know what the original Greek said. They don't even know when these things were written. They don't necessarily even know the historical context, or, haven't been encouraged to think critically about those things. Once I realized all of that, it seemed like, to the extent that anybody wants to get into, for example, medicine for ethical reasons, it seemed to me that there was an even greater ethical reason to go into this field as well, to try to make it more accessible.
Yeah, the foundations of our public policy, or of our just politics in general, are fascinating. I'm reading one of Jefferson's biographies right now, and in one of the papers, I can't remember which document it was you sent us, but you talk about how Jefferson attempted to whittle down the Gospels to what he thought were, let's say, the least polluted version of them, that didn't have a lot of mysticism and demons and sorcery and whatnot. And that's a really interesting project if you think about Jefferson as this guy who was obsessed over the classics and antiquity and Rome and Greece, and really trying to make this cross-cultural analysis of the best pieces of philosophy he could choose, and then using that to edit down the Bible into some version. I guess it's called the Jefferson. Is it called the Jefferson Bible?
It
Jefferson?
is. Yeah, he actually took, I don't know if he had a pair of scissors or a straight edge or whatever, but he actually cut one up and, cut and pasted physically. I actually have it here.
Cool.
Not the original one, but I have one of them that is from the special collections here. And it's the Jefferson Bible, Being, the Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. So the idea he had there was that Jesus was not a wonder worker performing miracles necessarily, that image of Jesus as the wonder-working charismatic is really something that was very Greco-Roman in feeling, in the sense that, the greater Greek and Roman world was into the gods and miracles and the fantastic and that sort of thing. That Jesus at heart was a philosopher, as you say, and that if you could strip back every time he performed an exorcism, that you would eventually get at the wisdom literature of this great philosophical figure. And Jefferson, as you point out, was very interested in the ancient world, the ancient Mediterranean world. And I think he really kind of styled himself on some ideal there. But he was also very into religions, some people would call world religions generally. He had many enslaved persons in his household who were Muslim. And he was very interested in that as well. And there's been a lot of great scholarship on that. And so he had kind of a lot of broad thinking. about religion. And in a way, he was kind of a humanist who was interested in challenging certain kinds of ideas. So definitely.
It's a cool example of something in documented history where you have this revision, this rational revision of the Bible, right? And it's easy for us to forget that the Bible itself, as it's handed down to us when we're kids in catechism class or whatever, is also this very cultivated work, right? There's pieces that have been accumulated and pieces that have been cut. And Jefferson seems to have kind of given a very concise example of how that's done, right? There's some intention of what's useful here, what should be passed on, and some, I don't know, for lack of a better word, values judgment about what isn't useful and what should be removed.
But this is go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. I can ask it in a second.
Well, I was just going to say, and that's very contingent on the context, what that person wants, right? And it's not value neutral. I mean, Jefferson had reasons that he wanted to think about morals and ethics over something like wonderworking. He wasn't interested in a redemptive side of that Christ message. He was interested in, I'm a philosopher, this guy's a philosopher. What can I extract in terms of some kind of essential wisdom from this figure? And that was very characteristic of that generation, of his social class as well. That's a reaffirmation of his wealth and standing in society, which is not an association I think people often make. But just as a codicil to what you're saying, one thing that I think grab people, their attention gets sort of piqued, or they get sucked in to the subject matter sometimes, because once they realize that there are no, say, what are called autographed copies of the Gospels, meaning that we don't have the original. If you pick up a Bible, any Bible today, it's already a translation of a translation of a translation of a translation. But the way that it's even put together, some scholar put that together, or a set of scholars made choices based on a variety of different manuscripts that happen to be preserved, some of them quite late, like 4th century, 6th century. The earliest pieces we have of any gospel are 2nd century. That's the earliest that survives. And usually they've been found in a garbage heap. And so they're, just fragments, like credit card size pieces of these writings. And so even what you have is already sort of a Frankenstein monster that has been put together over the course of centuries. But we don't have even, an original version of these things. So what Jefferson's doing, cutting up that Bible and putting it together piecemeal in a way, is what you already have when you open up the Bible to begin with.
When did people start thinking about that? Was there a period where the Bible was just this immutable object that was divine in provenance, and then at some point people started saying, well, hold on a second, somebody must have written it? Or was there always the sense that it came from the pen of man and was just, something worth accepting
to be
as
clear,
a whole?
there's plenty of people who think today, right? We have a friend who's like, no, like the Bible is written by God, like straight up, like that's right. When did that happen?
He's got other beliefs that make it.
But I don't think that's uncommon, right? Amongst some evangelical sect of America.
What I'm saying is he's also like a fan of flat Earth, and so the epistemic landscape inside of this guy makes me feel like that's probably a fringe perspective.
I don't think it's as fringe. Yeah,
it's at the very least like.
Let me put it this way:
highly correlated with other beliefs that I'm like don't seem to hold a lot of real world significance.
But like when I was a kid, I remember trying to make sense of all this, because on one hand you go to church and people treat it like it's a philosophical fairy tale that's useful, but on the other hand you ask them these point blank questions, and yes, it's written by God and so forth. So there's this weird fracture. So
like when you were coming up, people were telling you that it was written by God?
Depends who you talk to. Like people would soften it to certain degrees, but certainly there's a voice of that. Yes.
So there's a bit of an arc that would be something of a generalization, but I can kind of map it out from just my experience and different, having encountered different students and talking to different people. And I did get a degree in divinity, which is technically like a ministerial degree. So I had classmates and colleagues who take these positions. So I can kind of give you a synthetic view of what I think goes on, and there are variations to this. But people understand that the Gospels are written by a human being. But usually there's a couple of different ways that is contextualized. So one is that people will say, well, the gospel writers, yes, they were human beings, but they were recording down an oral tradition. And that oral tradition comes from what we might call the historical Jesus. So the idea behind this is that Jesus was such a miraculous presence, or so striking, that even if you heard him say something in one go as a random peasant somewhere in the Galilee, it would be so shocking to you that you would memorize it or know it by heart and tell everybody around you about it. Or the disciples heard him say one teaching enough times that they could memorize word for word exactly what he said, and that this oral tradition would go through the generations until finally the gospel writers, the academic consensus is that they are writing sometime after the Jewish War in 70 CE. So Jesus dies around 30. These are kind of general dates, but he dies sometime around 30. The first gospel at the earliest is written somewhere around 70, give or take. And so if that's the case, 40 years in antiquity is 2 generations. The life expectancy was about 21 to 23 years old. So the idea there is that there might have been some quote unquote eyewitnesses, but somebody passed this on orally over time. And then eventually some community, so we might call them a church of Jesus followers, because Christianity as such was not a separate religion from Judaism yet. But these people who see Jesus of Nazareth as the predicted Jewish Messiah have their sort of enclave. So let's call it a church or a community for argument's sake. And they have been holding on to this oral tradition. And they, because literacy is so limited in antiquity, they hire somebody, or they have the one literate dude in their enclave who can write it down, who finally decides to write the story down, so that the Gospels are the word of God insofar as Jesus is God, or the Son of God, and his word has been recorded faithfully down by the gospel writer. That's one track. The other track is that sometimes people will say they'll still probably hold on to that oral tradition theory in some measure, but you'll see this in, say, iconography, where you have a gospel writer very anachronistically represented as like sitting at a desk with a feather pen, which is not how people wrote, but that's back then, but whatever. But you'll have them.
How did they write? Sorry, you can't go on from that. What did they use? Ballpoint pens or?
Well, I mean, there are different theories, and obviously, I'm talking generally, but you would have somebody. I mean, there's a great scholar by the name of Canada Moss who has a book that just came out about this too. If you were wealthy enough to be educated enough to want to engage in the practice of writing, which very few people are worried about in the ancient world, because most people are like subsistence farmers. So if you're actually worried about this and have the wealth to do it, you enslave somebody to do it for you. People would enslave other humans and train them just so that they could take dictation from them or be their secretaries, we might say, but they had no choice in the matter. So you would force your enslaved person to do it for you. And, they didn't have necessarily desks. They would probably, write on a piece of papyrus or on a wax tablet, like squatting on the floor, and like with a reed pen that they'd have to shave over and over. And, these are kind of unwieldy pieces of paper, this papyri that they'd have to work with. It wasn't, like a library or like a college classroom, which I think sometimes people have in their minds. It was a much more complex kind of and rarefied event to write anything down. But you'll see this kind of iconography of something I would say that's more medieval, of a gospel writer with his pen, sitting at a leaning desk somewhere, and you'll have some representation, usually spirit, which we can talk about what that word means in Greek. But you'd have something like a dove representing the spirit, or later the Holy Spirit kind of inspiring the writer. So God is telling the writer what to put down, right? So you could have those two different representations. But as I've kind of hinted already, that's completely ahistorical. It's not representing book culture in the ancient world at all. It's not a model that we see anywhere else. It's one that I think well serves later theological need, especially a desire to be able to say Jesus absolutely said X, Y, and Z. Back to Jefferson, right? Jefferson's kind of doing the same thing. People want the security of knowing that this thing they're hanging their entire life on comes from a reliable source. And unfortunately for Christianity, writing is not a discipline in antiquity or a social practice in antiquity that was widespread enough that you can say that there is some kind of completely idiosyncratic approach to it. Where, for example, oral tradition, there are a few problems with that theory. One is that Jesus is speaking Aramaic and the Gospels were written in Greek. So not the same language, right? So right away, those aren't Jesus's words because somebody has translated them. So the earliest evidence you have of this is not even in his own language. So that's your first problem. But secondly, this is a little bit, I'm having some fun. But if you've ever played a game of telephone, people don't generally hold on word for word to the exact thing that somebody says to them without there being some kind of mistake, whether that mistake is intentional or not. There could be somebody who mishears something or somebody who receives some kind of information that for whatever reason in their present moment, they want to change because they have a certain bias or they think something wasn't completely accurate or they want to explain something or explain something away. And so the idea that there would be a reliable oral tradition that extends from the time of Jesus to the time of the gospel writers is also a stretch. When you add on to that the gospel writers clearly have been trained by reading Homer, by reading Plato, by reading other materials that are out there in the ether among that rarefied class of people who are reading and writing. They're not just writing because of the inspiration that they may or may not be receiving from their social group, from God, if we want to take that kind of language, but they are writing in a way that showcases that they're good writers, which is a completely human instinct. They are writing in a way that has structure and form that conforms to what you find in ancient biography, ancient history writing, ancient paradoxography, and they're making references to other kinds of popular literature of their age because they want anybody else who reads this, usually other writers, to think they're good at writing, right? It's not just some kind of self-sacrificing activity that comes out of nowhere. I mean, even something like the Gospel of Luke, which is much more of a novelistic sort of approach to the story of Jesus, has all kinds of elements that you find in something like the ancient historian Plutarch, down to things like, Jesus as a young man is smarter than his teachers, or how do you explain that he's the son of God? Like, where was the father in this scenario? Or there being cosmic signs at his birth. So the Star of David, right, in the nativity scene. Like, you have that with people like Alexander the Great. So there are a lot of shared narratives or echoes of narratives that were very popular in antiquity that you also see in the Gospels. And I know I'm rambling, but the last thing I'll say that's really important. Good. But the last thing I'll say about that is, so I'm glad I'm not boring you yet. But the last thing that I'll say about that is these kinds of echoes that are coming through the Gospels that relate to other kinds of literature indicate that we might have a different expectation for these texts than they did in antiquity, insofar as, in an era where they can't Google the answer to something, where they can't easily in antiquity confirm was so-and-so governor in this particular date. Sometimes you would give an impression of a fact, quote unquote, or an impression of a scenario, or give an allusion, a literary allusion to a particular detail in order to convey to your reader a sense of what was historically accurate, not the thing that was actually historically accurate. Because you have no way of actually confirming these things, and the audience has a higher tolerance for quote unquote mistakes in that case. Do you see what I mean by that? There's kind of a more acceptance of, like, maybe something's not technically right as long as I got the vibe.
All right, so we were trying to pick apart when it was that people started believing that this was the word of God.
Oh no, believing that it wasn't exactly the word of God, and that it was actually written by people.
Same thing.
So I think that the critical study of the Bible could be traced reasonably to around the Enlightenment period. So even back to Jefferson, that's a good starting point for us to talk about when people became a little bit more critical about what is going on with these texts, and especially the advent of what we might call the academy, or what people call the academy, but really that institutionalization of college, essentially, which came over to the United States from Europe and from the UK. And also Germany had a really big influence. So even our contemporary system of the university system or college, or this higher education, comes from that context or derives in some part from that context. So in the early stages of the academy, you didn't quite have the disciplinarity that we have now. So you would have somebody who would work on texts generally, and so they might work on some ancient Greek text of, say, let's just say Homer, just for simplicity's sake, but maybe they work on Homer, and then they take an interest in thinking about the Gospels a little bit, and then maybe they're also interested in some medieval text that they want to take a look at. And you are allowed to have a little bit more varied interest. Let's put it that way. You could take more varied interest in a variety of different things, and maybe bring the same methods that you would in one context to whatever you're interested in at that moment. So to make sure I echo back to something I talked about before that might help illustrate this, the Brothers Grimm would kind of try to reclaim the oral histories of the German people through fairy tales. So this is trying to get at the stories that the non-literate ancient German maybe passed around or thought was important, that you could get some kind of ethical, moral message from, or whatever else. So I'm thinking, very much about like what Disney has done with these narratives, right? So a lot of people are familiar with them. But in reality, the Brothers Grimm were actually stealing a lot of these stories from the French, or they would say that they talked to the common German person that they encountered out there in the world and learn these stories, but really they were just kind of talking to the women in their own households and kind of making it up on the fly, right? But these are the kind of things that people could do. They would take an interest in umbrella, oral tradition. So I'm going to look at it at a variety of different perspectives, including, for example, in the Bible. So I make it sound a little bit worse than maybe it was. So I want to be careful that I don't make it sound that amateurish. But I think that's really where you start to first get this idea that we can treat these texts differently. But the discipline within the field of religious studies of actually critically reading these texts and trying to recontextualize them historically, that's a pretty young field, actually. I would say people have only really been doing that for maybe 150 years, something like that. So in terms of genealogy, I can tell you that one of the major figures in the field, and obviously there are many, but it's a little bit too inside baseball, but one some people might have heard of is Bultmann, who is a famous theologian and a Lutheran theologian in Germany, who had a lot of influence on the contemporary field of religious studies today. I was the student of one of his students. So that's how much distance you have from people who were really doing historical critical work and represent the beginnings of some of that work and where we are today. So there's not that much distance.
And so would Bultmann have been working with this very specific New Testament dictionary that you mentioned earlier?
Oh yeah. And I was trained on it too. The only reason I've deviated from it is because I came from that classics background, which ended up being different, right? So I could read the Gospels and say to myself, this is a philosophical word, a term that I've seen in Plato before. So why are we translating it as XYZ here when in Plato he says it's this, right?
What's an example of that?
So the example that I think is the easiest for people, because it's very, once you click, I think it's very helpful, is this word, I won't pronounce, in ancient Greek, you would pronounce it something like pneuma, but the word is pneuma. Bless you. The word pneumonia, right? You know how there's a PN on it, or pneumatic, right? Pneumatic drill. So it means air, right? Like there's something to do with respiration in that. And it's a word coming from Greek. And so the word in Greek, I usually just say pneuma because pneumatic, right? It sounds more familiar to people. So the word pneuma in Greek was a technical term that was used, especially by the Stoics, that was understood to have physical properties. So they didn't obviously have microscopes, but they had basically a proto-atomic theory of how the world works. So the world is made up of substances. Some of them are so refined that they're invisible to the naked eye. But, I'm sitting in front of my office window. There's a storm about to come through. There are these big, heavy palm trees outside. I can see they're moving in the breeze. That breeze is physical somehow. It's strong enough to move a boat, move a tree, move a palm tree, right? Frond. I can see that it can do that. It has some kind of power and substance to it, but it's invisible to me. And that's because it's more ethereal and therefore must be closer to something we might call divine, right? It has some kind of tension. They would use this word called hexis, that it's this invisible substance that's super refined. It can mix with physical bodies. It has the power to change them, to move them, to have impact in the physical world. But because it's associated with quote unquote God, I can't see it because I'm just a human being. And so there are just some things in this earth that I'm not privy to. And this is one of them. That is the word that we translate as spirit. So think about how people treat the word spirit, right? Even in the Gospels, it comes down as a dove at the baptism of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, and it is the thing that goes into Jesus that turns him into God's son. Well, this word in Greek has a variety of different resonances. You know how any word is, you have like second, third, fourth, fifth definition. It could also be used for anything else that kind of animates or pervades or activates. And so it was used for the word sperm as well, by the way. And sperm had its own word as well, sperma. But this idea that a woman provides matter to a fetus, but that fetus has to be ensouled somehow, and you can ensoul them through this invisible stuff that creates animation and physical form. So this idea that Jesus's body could mix with God's spirit, with God's pneuma, it wasn't sexualized in the same way, but it's this idea that that's what is changing his status. That's what's turning Jesus into God's son. And when Paul in his letters talks about how to become part of this Jesus group, they don't have the word Christianity yet, but when he talks about it, he talks about being baptized into the Spirit. Well, people think that means I'm being baptized into, I don't know, some kind of kumbaya, right? Like get today. That's what somebody might think. In antiquity, it was I am being baptized because I'm receiving this pneuma that's going to mix with my physical body. I am now, I have a physical connection to Christ because he was God's son. And if I get baptized the way he was baptized, I'm being baptized into the Spirit as well, into this pneuma as well. If I share in that pneuma, that means in the end time, I have changed literally my parentage. I have literally become, the way Paul puts it, is a co-heir with Christ. I too have become a son or daughter, but son of God. So that's how I know I'll be like Jesus. Even if I die, I'm going to resurrect, right? So if you think of pneuma as, oh, this was a physical thing, suddenly all kinds of stuff make more sense. A lot of stuff makes more sense. One is what that language meant and how it was an actual physical change. Then you can also see how that's changed over time to 2,000 years from now. But the nice thing about seeing it the way I just described is I think sometimes people think about conversion as this self-evident thing that just spontaneously happens. And certainly there are stories in like Acts of the Apostles where like 500 people converted in like one moment, like in one burst. But we know sociologically that's never what happens. Quote unquote conversion is usually a process. It usually takes some time. And, if you're going to abandon your entire family, social system, life, whatever other quote unquote religion you had before, especially Paul is writing to non-Jews and trying to convince them to become part of this Jewish movement. He had to be convincing somehow. And it's not just enough to knock on somebody's door and say, this is what you should do. You have to give them a rationale. And in fact, Paul was giving them a very scientific explanation. If you do this, X, Y, and Z will happen. You will receive this pneuma, you'll receive this substance from God. People are already primed to believe in deities of various kinds in the ancient Mediterranean, so it's not that strange. And Judaism was a very ancient religion. People were very curious about it. So you could also claim, whatever in the Greek or Roman pantheon you think is important, well, Judaism had that long before. The original God was the God of the Jewish people. But if you read, the Hebrew Bible, there are certain, think about the golden calf. Some people fell away into wrong belief systems, into wrong practices. But there's still a chance for you. If I baptize you, you'll become a son of God again. You'll be a co-heir with Christ. And if the world's going to end, you'll be in the right group. And so sociologically, that makes a lot more sense too. But again, if you're just picking up a New Testament dictionary that tells you it means spirit, you're going to import 2,000 years of interpretation into what that word spirit means. And you lose what it meant for someone like Paul, or you lose what it meant for someone like the author of the Gospel of Mark.
Which is kind of a mechanistic vision of how the process worked. I was reading...
Yeah, it reminds me of science.
That's what I was going to say. I was reading the piece that you sent about Paul and the moon, and I was surprised by how it was really an attempt at a mechanistic explanation. Like, yes, it was deeply spiritual, and there was this idea of the moon as being the place of souls, but still it was an attempt to rationalize what is otherwise a very ephemeral belief system.
Yeah, and if I could add too, it seems like this concept of spirit won't leave us alone. It's actually it might not have that same word associated with it, but we've been talking to a lot of consciousness researchers lately, right? Which is funny because consciousness as a concept in science would have been completely
verboten.
Yeah. It was off limits 30 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago, but now it's all the rage. And what's so fascinating about it is a lot of even these hardcore neuroscientists are starting to entertain a more pneumatic concept, really.
And they're tying themselves in knots to be able to avoid saying the word spirit. They're like, there's a thing that permeates the universe that perhaps we just tune into. And it's like,
and these are very serious neuroscientists, like this is, could never have predicted it would have gone this way.
No, it's wild.
And the word will is also very hard. People have been looking for this vital essence of cells, like what animates matter. Like, yeah, there's molecules and stuff, but like, why do they do what they do? What are they driven by? And the biologists really don't want to talk about it, but they seem to also realize that they can't get away from it at the same time.
Well, that's exactly what Paul is doing. Yeah, and that's the thing I try to convey, especially to my students, that's why I like using pneuma as an example. And sometimes I get tired of talking about it. But I see exactly what you're talking about because there's a great interest in cognitive science and neuroscience within religious studies. But it drives me a little bit mad because there's a corner of religious studies, and I don't mean this in any way to call out any of my colleagues. So let me just be clear that I'm not going to give a specific example, and I'm not saying these are bad people, but just kind of an observation like you're making. Which is people will talk about, I'm trying to remember the word, but there's a word when you exercise and you get into like a flow where you're sort of feeling disembodied and you're kind of in the zone. And I will hear my colleagues talk about that as if it's a real thing that is not a physiological condition, but almost like a spiritual one, and then compare that to religious experiences and that kind of thing. And there's nothing in principle wrong with those kinds of comparisons. Except that if you're not actually describing something concrete, I have a lot of trouble with it. If you're not contextualizing it within some kind of sociological observation or an understanding of biology, right? Or something that's more concrete for me to just kind of talk about essences or the ethereal or the spiritual in a way that doesn't have any propositional content, that makes me a little bit batty.
It's just it's so vague that it could almost mean anything to anybody. And honestly, in science, we have these words too that everybody throws around. Even the word consciousness, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, what do you mean by that exactly? And different people mean different things, so they end up talking past each other. And I think the word spirit ends up in that camp too, where it can mean so many different things.
Yeah, if it doesn't have propositional content to me, I start to get really agitated, and it is my toxic trait. As a colleague, and I'm aware of it. But I have a big problem with religion for that reason too. What does the word religion mean? because I think that there are two modes that sometimes people will go into in the field. One is to say everything is a religion. Baseball is a religion. Politics is a religion. Shopping is a religion, which then makes everything possibly a religion. Therefore, what the heck are we studying? And I worry about that too within a situation where a lot of religious studies departments are shutting down. People don't value the humanities in the same way. If you are telling me that everything out there is a religion, then what are we doing? Because obviously there is something in the world historically that people do by associating themselves and clustering themselves in certain ways that can be observed and described and considered as a humanistic field of study that doesn't involve then relating it to baseball as much as I love baseball. And so I get a little bit obsessed with that too, because you'll also hear people sometimes say everything's a religion or nothing is. Religion is just a scholarly category for the scholar's purposes, and it doesn't exist out there in the world. So therefore, when we look at the ancient world, those aren't necessarily religions, they're something else. But I think we can have definitions if we're just clear at what our definitions are. If we're out there as academics to describe something, then let's be very clear about what we're describing, or otherwise, as you say, we're just talking across purposes and there's no actual propositional content to the claims that we're
I mean, if it
making.
makes you feel any better, I think the same thing is happening in almost every academic science. Like physics is the same way. It's like, well, what do you mean by physics? Because it sounds like you're talking about literally the birth of the universe, like everything. You've basically taken over every single discipline from the humanities and everything. It's like, if we really just restrict it to physical objects, well, all of a sudden we have to define physical objects, which gets really boring because you're just talking about things knocking into each other, pulling on each other. And it's just, it doesn't have the same religious importance. It doesn't have the same spiritual over totalizing authority that it would have otherwise. And so I wonder if there's some creep in each one of these disciplines to have more to say about everything than perhaps they're really intended to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Could be. And I think some of my anxiety about it just comes from, as I mentioned, I think people don't sometimes know what religious studies people do. If you hear about the religious studies department, what's going on in there, and maybe back to the kind of confessional side of things, coming from class, like I think I'm a classicist, and I try to hobnob with the classicists who are on the same floor as me here at the university, and I, offer to like teach the Greek classes and all that. And I have very, very welcoming and generous colleagues, but I can also tell I'm in religious studies, whatever that is, and classics is this other thing, right? We have this disciplinarity. And I think if we can't, again, articulate exactly what we're doing, then sometimes, it gets just too diffuse. And so I think it's important for people to understand what exactly these different fields are getting at.
So how do you define religion?
Well, there are academic definitions that I think are a little too high-minded. So, for example, you would say that it is a discipline that is concerned with the practices and behaviors of human beings around non-obvious beings. And people are very clear to not say supernatural because these are inherently natural beings in human life. We might use words like supernatural, but especially if you look at the ancient world too, if you have a deity that is centered around agriculture, for example, it really matters whether or not you have proper disposition or practices towards that deity so your crops grow, right? So depending on context, there are a lot of different situations where this is a very natural thing. And so people hold different propositions in relationship to those non-obvious beings. And from there, you have different social practices, whether it's the production of texts or certain kinds of gatherings or other phenomena like that. So that's typically how we define it. But that's obviously it's stuff people do around gods, I guess, is the simplest way to put it.
I like that. That. All right, so can we roll back to what the heck was happening around the birth of Christianity and maybe try to shine some light on what you've learned across your studies about that moment and the inception and who the heck these people were?
Because we've briefly talked about this, how astonishing it is that you have a guy who teaches and is part of a relatively small group that is his followers, and that set of teachings very quickly becomes this massive organized entity. And I don't really understand very well how that transition happens. And so to me, it's very perplexing.
There's we can't think of any really good examples of that in modern time. I mean, maybe Scientology or something like that, but you very rarely have just some guy who has some cool ideas that are reminiscent of other cool ideas, and then all of a sudden it's just gangbusters, just takes over the universe.
I mean, I think in some ways I can contextualize science in that frame, where I look at the birth of science as a new way of looking at things. And there's the prophets at the beginning, like Francis Bacon was with his idea of the scientific method, and Newton, and you have this collection of people who are the prophets. And then that becomes wildly popular. And now I think that you can look at science as being a very robust belief system. We saw in the last few years people constantly being like, I trust in science, I believe in science. And you're like, that's a crazy thing to say. And I don't think that people realize how crazy it is to say and what it tells about their own orientation towards the power of science. But that's the closest approximation that I can see. And I'm like, well, that took about 300 years.
I actually really like this question because nobody's asked me to just game out before. Sometimes it's in piecemeal, but I don't think anybody's ever asked me to give like how did this happen step by step. So I'll give you the very much my version of it, although it's informed by my field. So there was some guy named Jesus. I don't doubt that he was a historical dude. What he was doing is not as clear because we do not have anything written, no evidence, concrete evidence from anybody, from him, certainly, but any of his followers. So they didn't write anything down. And we don't have any reliable testimony from any of them. What we do have, the earliest writings we have are from the letters of Paul, who I mentioned before, but Paul never met Jesus. He hitches on to this movement, what we sometimes call the Jesus movement, 10, 15, 20 years later. And so Jesus dies around 30. Paul, he's probably in the game within like half a decade to a little bit more. He's familiar with people who see Jesus as this potential messianic figure. And because he's what's called a Pharisee at this time, someone who interprets the law, his job is to kind of tap down any upstart movements. And so he describes it as pursuing people who have basically, I'll call it unorthodox ideas. And it's not exclusive to people who are following Jesus. What's going on in Judea at this time are we have evidence for multiple different kinds of groups like this. And so these are sort of rebellious groups because, or that was one term to kind of illustrate what I'm going to get at. I mean, this is a territory that was put under the auspices of the Roman Empire against their will. So they're basically occupied by the Romans and they don't like it. And what happens when people are occupied, native peoples are occupied by a force they don't like, they rebel. So we have evidence for multiple figures who either claimed to be a Messiah, a Jewish Messiah, who were, their followers thought they were the Jewish Messiah, who claimed that they would be able to usher in a new age in opposition to this Roman occupation. So one figure you've probably heard of is John the Baptist. Unclear whether John the Baptist claimed he was the Messiah, other people thought he was, whether that was even part of what was going on with him, but he had a certain following who saw him as a charismatic authority or other kind of authority in opposition to this occupying force. So Paul encounters these Jesus people. At first, he's not a part of this movement because he sees them as kind of these outliers for what is, traditional Judaism. At some point, he has what is typically called his conversion experience, but what he claims is, I think you would say in a greater ancient Mediterranean context, is essentially a divination experience, which people have all the time. The god appears to them, tells them something, and they're able to channel it. So think about, you've heard of oracles, right? Like people would go to oracles who channel the deity. So Paul has some kind of experience where he says that he encounters the risen Christ. So he starts using this word Christ. That wasn't Jesus's name. He was Jesus of Nazareth. As far as we know, the word Christ means anointed one. So he encounters this resurrected Jesus who says to him, you've got it all wrong. I am the Messiah. You can trust me on this because the Messiah is supposed to deliver the Jewish people from evil. What is the greatest evil on earth? Death. What have I done in resurrecting? I've defeated death. So my faith in God's plan, allowing myself to be crucified, even though you wouldn't expect that from the Messiah, he chose to resurrect me. So now you know I am the Messiah. I'm going to come back. And I've chosen you, Paul, to deliver this message to everyone. So that's what Paul claims. So he takes it upon himself to then say that he is in constant communication with this risen figure, this Christ figure. And so he's getting the latest intel to let everybody know what Jesus' plan is. In the meantime, he encounters James, the brother of Jesus, and Peter, who everybody has heard of, who's supposed to, anachronist, the rock of the church, right? So these were people who were actually followers of Jesus. And it's not clear any of these guys really got along. So in Paul's letters, he'll be like, I saw Peter, what a jerk. Like I'm summarizing, right? But he's such a hypocrite. Like he says this, and this, but like then he won't eat with, like the right people. And he gets really snobby. And so I got in his face and I told him he's a huge snob and I know I'm right. Like these guys did not exactly get along. We know very little about what James was up to specifically. So I know Jesus existed as a historical person in part because otherwise who is Paul talking to? And we have Paul's letters at least, right? So Occam's razor, what's the simplest explanation here? Like that these were real people. But you're getting testimony from a guy who is not, maybe opposition is too strong, but he's basically saying, he never tells us, Paul, really anything about the historical Jesus, because why would he? His authority is coming from saying he's having the divination experiences of the risen Christ. So he actually thinks he's more important in some ways than these guys who knew the dude while he was alive, right? Peter and James who knew Jesus while he was alive.
And that has the cultural context of people already being really comfortable with this oracle tradition, right? This
absolutely
seer, right? That was the bedrock of Roman religion, even Greek religion, going
absolutely
all the way back.
Hey folks, a quick interruption. If you are listening to the podcast and you are enjoying it, consider coming over to patreon.com/demystifysci. We could really use your help in making the podcast bigger, better, and stronger. And so I really hope that you'll consider it and that we'll see you at patreon.com/demystifysci.
I think Paul really inspires a lot of the content in the Gospels because they might not have distinguished between what somebody claimed from a divination experience was the historical case and something that's actually historical. So back to our hangups in modernity and the questions we want something to answer are not necessarily what was going on in the context, right? So a gospel author might use Paul. I'll give you a quick example. Last Supper, right? Everybody's heard the Last Supper. Paul describes that as something he received as a divination experience from Jesus. That the Lord, he says, by way of the Lord appeared to me and told me he had this meal, and here's what he said. It eventually makes its way into the Gospels. If you look at a study Bible, it will tell you in like the footnotes, like, oh, how weird that Paul has this and the Gospels have this. This must be an oral tradition from the beginnings of the Jesus movement that somehow made it on both tracks. When the clearer explanation, and Paul tells you exactly where he got it. He doesn't say, I got it from an oral tradition, Peter told me. He says, the risen Christ told me, and now I'm going to tell you. So when the gospel writers read that later, they say like, oh, well, this is legit. Like Jesus told Paul. He maybe was not alive at the time. It was the risen Christ who said it, but we're going to put that in, right? That makes a lot more sense for the kind of historical context you're describing. Exactly right.
I mean, and there's one thing about these visions, right? My mind is kind of going in two different directions right now because we're actually seeing the rebirth in an individualized sense of people seeking out these kind of experiences in the psychedelic community in particular. Yeah. People will go on these very expensive trips to Brazil and have these psychedelic voyages where they...
Ayahuasca and that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting because today it's very personalized, right? Like you have the experience. You don't just gather around somebody who's had the experience as in the past. But what's really interesting about these experiences is that they're highly contextualized based on your cultural upbringing. So like if I was raised in the church, I might actually see Jesus or whatever, right? But if I was raised in the jungle, I might see panthers and other things that are central to the mythology. I know you don't like that word, but to the mythology
no, it's okay.
of that culture, right? To the mythopoetic tradition of that culture, let's say. And so I wonder to what extent Paul's, as much as we can imagine him having this divination or this psychedelic experience or whatever the heck it was, how that reflected some sort of underlying current that was already in the world at that moment.
Absolutely. So really quick, John the Baptist out in the desert eating unrefined honey. Do you know what happens when you eat unrefined honey? You trip.
Mm.
So when John the Baptist is like coming out of the desert saying all these prophetic things, he's probably tripping, which is something that because we want to put kind of a pristine veneer on anything quote unquote religious, it would be hard to convince, I think, people coming from a traditional religious background to be like, yeah, basically, John the Baptist is probably like having ayahuasca trips and
Mm.
then coming out and telling you what he saw. Right.
There's
But
been
that,
some general scholarship about psychedelics in the religious context, right? With the acacia tree and the burning bush and things like this.
Mhm.
I think what's the sacred crop? Yeah, Morarescu wrote an interesting book. I mean, I don't know if they're right or wrong, but there's certainly people making those cases that the psychedelic plants and so forth have been there way before all of these Western traditions, and people kind of folded them in different ways.
Yeah, there's a lot of great work in religious studies on this. There's also to just give people out there to give a shout out to a colleague of mine, I Ted Slingerland, who is a colleague at UBC, University of British Columbia. Recently had a book called Drunk, I think is what he called it,
Hmm.
but it's about the history of alcohol, and I think there is some discussion of substances in general and how that intersects with a history of religious practice. So I do have a lot of colleagues who are working on this, and it's a really interesting field. Someday I'll publish my John the Baptist tripping on unrefined honey paper,
But
but that is definitely going on. And oracles often were near caves. So like, you know, this vision you might have like the Delphic Oracle, because there are fumes coming out of the cave that create different kinds of cognitive states. So when they talk in these rhymes, it's a very, very, very similar thing. And I think we need to be very attentive to that. And the idea of, for example, also speaking in tongues or channeling some kind of experience. Paul is tapping into that, but he is by no means the only one who's doing this kind of thing in antiquity for sure.
so there's this thread that we're very well aware of, and anthropologists today have studied this, that people's divine visions reflect something about their culture usually. It at least comes in the form
Yeah.
of that. What did Paul's vision reflect about the culture at the time?
So he describes himself, or at least his understanding of what's happening to him, which is very interesting in and of itself, that before his birth, he was chosen by the God of Israel, you know, by this God of the Jewish people to be a prophet, as all other prophets. And as a Pharisee, his job was to be very well versed in the Hebrew Bible. Because if you look at the Hebrew Bible, there's a lot of what's called the quote unquote law, right? There's the law, which is the first 5 books of Moses, but that text gives a lot of, parameters for how to live your life. But not all of them can answer all questions. And so you would have Pharisees as interpreters of the law, which means that they would help you understand and read into this text to know how to live your life or to answer certain questions, both about day-to-day life and about ethics. And so Paul's very well versed in this, and because he knows the Hebrew Bible so well, that's his context. He sees himself as, the Jewish Messiah has been predicted. He's now here. I'm now his spokesperson, so I am a prophet. And so God picked me well before my birth that this was going to be my role, and now here I am, and I'm going to perform this role. And the other thing that he does is, rather than think, you mentioned, Christianity seems to have had kind of almost this explosive presence on the scene. Now,
Virality.
yeah, I think it's slower than that, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But the thing that Paul does, which is why, despite all of his downsides, right, like he didn't know Jesus, he doesn't seem to get along with anybody who actually knew the guy, etc. He interprets the Hebrew Bible in such a way, and we talked about this a little bit before, but that everybody was once, the God of Israel's child, but some people fell away. And his understanding, some of those people have to come back into the fold for this new era to happen that we're waiting for this new kingdom to arrive, for what, we would call like the second coming, right? Or to use some kind of contemporary language. And so the reason it hasn't happened yet is that it can't just be a Jewish movement. We have to bring some of these, what are called Gentiles, non-Jews at the time, back into the fold. And that's why I'm the prophet for this. That's my job. So Peter, James, stay in Jerusalem, Jewish movement in rebellion against the Roman occupying authority. Do what you were going to do in Jerusalem. We actually don't know what happens to them. They just kind of disappear. There's all kinds of church traditions. We don't know what happens to any of these guys, really. We don't even know what happens to Paul. But you stay there. And they sort of agreed to disagree. Like they just said to Paul, okay, you go talk to some Gentiles, right? Like you go do what you think you need to do. We're going to do what we're going to do. Just like get out of here. That's more or less like kind of how there's a little bit of a division there. And so that's how Paul sees himself, that his job is now to talk to all these non-Jews and explain, to figure out how many of them do I graft into this movement is the language he uses. He uses this agricultural language. How many of them do I baptize to give them the pneuma, to bring them into this movement, to create this change in them so that they basically become part of this Jewish movement. Now, the change that he makes, which is why I think he was effective to some extent, although it's not clear because these kinds of changes are slow, how effective he was in his lifetime. But the thing that he says is there's the Jewish law for the Jewish people, which include things like dietary laws and circumcision. For Gentiles who come into the fold, you don't have to do that because that's the covenant that God made with his people on this track through Abraham, right? Through Moses, right? He had different covenants through these other figures. Jesus is a new figure who is there to bring in these Gentiles. So it's the covenant of his death, resurrection, baptism, Eucharist, these new acts, these new practices that establish this new covenant between that same God, but this other group of people. So you have to baptize, you have to participate in Eucharist, you have to have, all these other, everything everybody's familiar with that later become part of what we call Christianity. You people do those things, and you're all going to be on the same level, right? You're on equal footing with the Jewish people, but now you'll be part of the fold. So it's unclear at that time whether or not Christianity is its own religion. This vision that people sometimes have of like Jesus came down and he started a new religion and people followed him and it was obvious and then it just continued. It's not obvious what Jesus was trying to do. What happens is that Paul appears, makes these authoritative claims about his status and how he understands the purpose of Christ. He always talks about Christ. He very rarely talks about Jesus. He even sometimes says Christ Jesus instead of Jesus Christ. Like for him, it's very clear what the focus needs to be. And it's that Christ figure that he is worried about. And that's the one that is going to be the mechanism by which you bring these other people into the fold. Are they being brought into Judaism? Well, it's a different kind of Judaism if it is, because it's a different covenant, right? But it's still a covenant with the same God. It's the same God of the Jewish people.
Yeah, it cuts both ways, right? Because you're also maybe bringing the Jewish community into I don't know what the word is.
It's like a big tent. Right?
Yeah, right. It seems like there's like this effort at inclusivity in a way, because it's actually very hard to become Jewish even today. Like you can do it, but it's very easy to become a Christian, right? You just kind of say I'm with it, and obviously it's a little more complicated.
Not to reduce it to this, but I think it's always important to be practical, and I talk about practices in general a lot. If you don't have to circumcise to become part of a group in the ancient world, that's a big deal. Right? There's no painkiller, there's no antibiotic, and you're an adult male. It's not preferable, right? I think so. Just as one example of why I think what Paul did had some purchase, because in this era too, again, people are interested in ancient things, and there's very little that's more ancient than the Hebrew Bible and the Jewish people, right? So already non-Jews are interested in what's going on this religion, especially after the Romans occupied Judea, because there's always this colonizer's mindset of the place you colonize, then you sort of become, I think, like a cultural leech on whatever is going on with those peoples. And whether it's because you're interested in that culture or because you want the resources, cultural resources, physical resources out of those regions. And the Romans are certainly, guilty of this. Whether it's Judea or Germania or Dacia or any place else that they occupied as the empire continued to grow. So once they took over Judea,
they became curious about these people they were vanquishing, right? Like, what's their religion like? Oh, this is pretty ancient. Can we borrow that? They did the same thing with the Egyptians, like they would encounter Isis and be like, oh, Isis is cool. Give Demeter Isis's headdress because Isis's outfit's much cooler than Demeter's like OG outfit. So like, let's steal that, right? There's this kind of appropriation that goes on. So Paul had been educated in a traditional Greek way. He was what's usually called a Hellenized Jew. So he already knew Plato and the Stoics and all that philosophy and all that terminology we were talking about. So when he then talks to Gentiles, he doesn't exclusively talk in terms of Judaism. That's kind of an insular idea that we might have about that religion, but he relates it to science, right? Like, this is how you know what I'm telling you is legit. Sure, the Hebrew Bible describes it in this kind of way that, we might think is more ethereal in the ways we've been talking about, but I can tell you they use the word pneuma in the Septuagint. We know what that word means because in Stoicism, it's X, Y, and Z, right? And Stoicism, especially in the first century, had an idea that despite all the other deities that are out there, there's one high deity that works with Judaism. That there are eons to human events and human life and the universe, which means the Stoics would talk about a conflagration, that there are eons that begin and end with a great fire, the universe purifies itself, and then it starts again. And so if you're talking about a new kingdom that's coming and a new world order, and the world starting again, which is essentially what you're talking about when you have references to the rapture or, however else people understand this coming, that worked with Stoicism, right? So all of that Paul is importing into, again, his job is to interpret the Hebrew Bible, and he's using the Septuagint. So he's reading the Hebrew Bible in Greek. And he's seeing the exact same thing we've been talking about, that these are the same ideas, just the Jewish version is more ancient than whatever was the pop cultural philosophical moment of the first century. So he brings these things together. And in addition to what do people like to do when they want to feel, in this period, especially they've arrived or they're participating in a social activity that, symbolizes their membership in elite culture. They want to talk about philosophy. They want to have a dinner party. They want to seem like they're able to have these sophisticated conversations. And so when Paul writes his letters, he's usually writing to a head of a household who has the money to, he's asking for money usually, he's fundraising, but he's also saying bring me in. We could talk about all these philosophical ideas and I'll interpret scripture for you, bring your whole household in, we'll have a conversation, we'll have a dinner party, we'll all get together. So it became a very social thing too. So when he's traveling around writing these letters and that kind of thing, he's engaging, and you have the ability, if you interact with him, to get kind of a special membership, become part of this ancient group you're already interested in, hobnob with him, talk about science and philosophy and religion with him. And that is a very, again, practical way of understanding how that all begins, right?
So something that I didn't totally catch in this story is Paul at first an agent of Rome and then decides to defect? Because you said originally that his job was to interpret the law.
We don't understand entirely what it meant to be a Pharisee in the diaspora, but he does seem to be, and we said that we would kind of try to talk naturally in this conversation. So I'll put it this way. He's like a middle manager, like a bag man. Right? So who's his boss? I'm not sure. He's a Roman citizen, but there's somebody in an official capacity who's Paul, go out there and take care of it, right? He's the guy that, when you have a company that brings in somebody an efficiency expert, right? He's the dude that you send out to be what's going on over there? Whip them into shape, right? So he was sort of middle management from what we can tell.
And so interesting. So, it points at this wider state conspiracy to fold in the Jewish people to the Roman program.
Well, I also wanted to ask, from what I've read, the idea of the pantheon of the gods started to fall out of favor around this time. And when I was reading some of the later Greek works, it seemed like they would refer back to the time where the pantheon of gods was considered to be much more real than at the moment that they were writing. And so I wonder if there's also a current of wanting some sort of new religious organization.
Simplification,
something to replace this antiquated way of seeing things that people have become wise enough to recognize as perhaps not the modern contemporary way of encountering religion.
I think some of that vision, I understand where it comes from, that trajectory, comes a little bit, I think, from a version that Christianity might have imported to some extent, insofar as it's certainly the case that the gods, let's say, fall out of favor after a few hundred years, after what we call Christianity is quote unquote founded, right? But it's not that fast. And certainly I mentioned before, just in case it doesn't make it into the final cut, but I was talking about a text that talks about a resurrected Homeric hero and having faith in that hero. That text is 3rd century. So by the early 3rd century, you still had people talking about the cult of Homeric heroes, right? So they're not totally out of favor. Eventually, Christianity does make its way into among the elites, the true like native aristocracy of Rome. And then by the time you get, like Constantine, right? Everybody's heard of him saying that Christianity is now a protected religion. Then you start to see Christianity rise to the top, right? And that's where what you were saying makes sense to me. Like some of these quote unquote idols fall away. But even after Constantine, there was another emperor called Julian the Apostate who was like, no, we're going back to the old way, right? So there was some tossing back and forth. And certainly, right now we're coming near an election, right? And so it's kind of like the Democrats and Republicans or something, right? Like you have kind of a swing back and forth for a long time between two parties. You could envision it that way. And so it takes a while for Christianity to really rise to the top, in part because when I was saying, definition of religion and these practical aspects, it's awfully hard to convince somebody who is a subsistence farmer or depends on agriculture that you're not going to sacrifice to Demeter to make sure your crops, are successful that season, right? Like you're just going to have your faith in an entirely different God when your life depends on it. It takes a while for people, I think, to make that move. And so the traditional gods that are associated with things like nature and the fields and that kind of stuff, I think they take longer as well, for people to completely let go of those practices and those beliefs. So it does take some time, I think, for Christianity to rise to that level. What's happening in the 1st century, though, is 2 things I think are important. One is a word that is a little problematic, but I think works, as syncretism. So there's people, especially as the empire grows and people are encountering other territories, peoples they may never have encountered before, and taking a curiosity in their practices, their gods, their beliefs. There's some borrowing that goes on, or there's some cultural exchange that goes on that actually makes things a lot messier. Right? Because now there are a lot of different gods and local deities to contend with. Or sometimes the Romans would go into a territory and they would say, you worship this deity, this local god. Oh, actually, I'll just go back to Demeter for the sake of argument. That was Demeter. You were worshiping Demeter the whole time. You just didn't know it. So call that deity Demeter, whatever you called her before, because we're in charge now. Right? So you also have some of that going on. But it's also important to remember that Christianity wasn't the only new religious movement in this period. Just the other ones, people don't still worship them, right? So I mentioned Isis before. One of my favorite stories to tell my students is that at one point Rome decided to bring in an Isis cult because they decided Isis was like a hot new deity and they wanted to like bring her into Rome so that the deity would be in Rome and they could worship her there because they were very into Egyptian stuff. Sometimes scholars will talk about the 1st century as a period of Egyptomania. So if you've ever been to Rome and wondered why there are a million Egyptian obelisks everywhere, the Roman emperors brought those in. So there's still a Roman tomb in Rome from a Roman general that's shaped like a pyramid. So people were into this in this period. And so they brought the Isis cult in and they had a big parade. I'm simplifying this obviously, but they had a big parade for the inauguration of this new temple. And they didn't realize that the Isis priests were going to castrate themselves during the march.
Whoa.
So all the Roman people are there for the ticker tape parade or whatever you call it. And then these guys started castrating themselves. And the Romans were like, whoa, like we didn't know you were going to do that. Right. And so it caused some problems after the fact. Right. So there would be great enthusiasm for new stuff. And some of it clicked, some of it didn't. So there are a lot of interesting stories along those lines where like maybe a movement or a new religion would get like some momentum and then you'd be like, oh, wait a minute. Or it would kind of make its way into the ether. One
What
way or
about
another.
Jesus, the character himself? He seems, I've heard some, or I can see some overlaps in like the ancient Persian religions, right? Like the Manichaeism and Zoroastrianism. There seems like there's precedent for a character like Jesus, like that hero isn't brand new with Jesus, this self-sacrificial philosopher king who's telling everybody to be nice to each other, essentially.
Yeah, or someone like Asclepius, who was the healing god. You know, that was a real guy. Asclepius was apparently a really, really good doctor.
Hmm.
And then after he died, he became what we refer to as a pan-Hellenic hero, meaning people started to worship Asclepius at cult sites because he was, you know, maybe he would heal them because he was known to be such a good doctor in his lifetime. So when you think about Jesus, for example, healing the hemorrhaging woman, there was an interesting thing in antiquity where you would have testimonials from people that were healed at Asclepius sites, kind of like billboards. We have some of these inscriptions still. It'd be like, you know, my name is like, I don't know, like Sappho, just like pulling some names out of a hat that people might know. Like, hi, I'm Sappho. I came to this Asclepius temple because I was hemorrhaging and it healed me in 3 days, like 2 thumbs up, like it, basically like a Yelp review. And
Call
so
1-800, yeah.
yeah, that was basically. And so when I see that kind of thing in the Gospels, I'm like, yep, I know where that came from, right? Like you could get some of these other characters or figures, historical figures, religious figures, mythological figures, whatever word we want to use, but there's a lot of overlap in the stories that people were interested in telling or how they would convey the status of someone. And that's not a value judgment of, is it true? Is it not? Is it historical? Is it not? It's just a fact of the evidence, right? So, you know, an interesting thing about the Gospels and an interesting thing going back to Paul and thinking about that trajectory, like how did Christianity get into the bloodstream of Rome, of the Roman Empire, is so
Which
Jesus
is,
was
by the way, can I just say it's like completely nuts that you go from feeding Christians to lions to state religion in a matter of a couple hundred years. That's just,
well, that's because
wild.
that's a lot of that is made up.
Okay, well, that helps.
I mentioned the work
that's
of
the
Canada
vision we
Moss
have
before,
on the outside.
but she has a great book called The Myth of Persecution. And actually, long before she and I became colleagues and friends, I had read that book. And it was just groundbreaking. And she points out that, you know, often when you have a new group trying to create in-group dynamics, they will claim persecution against an imaginary persecutor to be able to say, like, it's us against the world, right? And so that seems to be what was going on with a lot of those narratives. We do have evidence for, you know, periodic kind of upsurges where the Christians got out of hand and they had to be tapped down, but it wasn't personal, meaning it wasn't necessarily because they were Christians per se. It was because it was like a larger problem. They weren't paying their taxes or they were creating some kind of scene or something like that. And that was just kind of a general punishment. Like you get arrested, you're found guilty. This is one method of killing you in antiquity. But the Christian narrative became like, we're persecuted. See what they're doing to us. It's because we're a threat, right? But that's an anachronistic view of what was happening there. So it just shows the effectiveness of that rhetoric, right?
But nonetheless, you have the rise, you have the birth of a new state religion in a fairly short amount of time.
You do. One thing I'll say before I go back to Paul for a minute is Constantine is often viewed as this, you know, the emperor who makes Christianity the state religion. Actually, what he does is say, I've accepted it. So now you can build churches. It's not like against the law. But if you even look at his triumphal arch in Rome, there's no Jesus on it, right? He maintained an interest, I guess, or maintained some kind of affinity for, or, you know, recognition of the other Roman gods. It was more like his mother who got like deep into it and some members of his family. I'm not saying that he wasn't, but, you know, it's often simplified that Constantine like switched, you know, flipped the script and then everything just changed. It was messier than that. And as for Jesus as this figure, wonder worker, etc., and how much of that relates to other pre-existent motifs or examples that are out there, I mentioned that Jesus didn't write anything down. Disciples don't write anything down. Paul never knew the guy. Paul never tells us that Jesus is like really performing miracles, not on the level that you have in the Gospels. He seems to understand him to be some kind of, speaker of some kind of teaching, right? He tells us a couple of things that Jesus says are things you should and shouldn't do. So, for example, somewhere he'll say, Jesus would tell you don't commit adultery, right? Like he had a couple of teachings that he had heard of, but not much because he's focused on this Christ figure. So, what is the evidence that Jesus was going around healing people and performing miracles? Unfortunately, it's dodgy, right? And that's the kind of thing that you associate with the kind of figures you're talking about, right? That are already pre-existent in the Greek and Roman pantheon or part of ancient Mediterranean culture. And so I think that he becomes a little bit of an avatar because people cared, right? I just want to be clear. I'm not saying that it's completely made up and therefore, should be looked down upon or dismissed, but because people cared about what he represented, they gave him sort of the best of, right, of some of these aspects. So if we start to wonder, how is it that Jesus caught on? It's because of a really effective way of being inclusive, which we've talked about, of tapping into ideas that people find really compelling, to tap into social practices that people wanted to be a part of. And it becomes like it's in this sweet spot of all of these things that we know are going on in the ancient Mediterranean world. And it takes several hundred years until it really gets institutionalized and established and makes its way into the imperial order, etc. But it's a long process. It's a difficult process. It looks short to us because we're 2,000 years, looking up, looking down on it. And when you think about like what was going on 300 years before us, like you start to realize like, oh, that's a really freaking long time, actually, right? Like that is a long time. But that seems to be what goes on.
At the end of the day, do you have a sense kind of off the academic record of how much of this was centrally planned? Like, was there a vision for this becoming the state religion at some point, or it just happened to work out that way?
I think it worked out that way. There's a great scholar by the name of John Kloppenborg who actually went through like all the inscriptions, all of the evidence for the word for church in Greek is ecclesia. And so when you see the word church, in the Bible, that's the word in Greek. That word already existed. It was a word for essentially, the word means assembly, but it had a meaning already in antiquity. I'm going to oversimplify this as well, but I think it's helpful. Like there was no fire department in antiquity. So if somebody's house was on fire, you had an ecclesia that was in charge of that. If somebody died in antiquity, there wasn't like a funeral parlor, but there was an ecclesia that would help you bury the person. And if you were a part of that, it's almost like a union. So there were people who would have ecclesia that would have a patron deity that was a part of it. You would pay your dues to that ecclesia. So, and maybe it was like based on, say, your profession. So like all the bakers in town would have an ecclesia where they would have like public works that they would do. You would pay your dues as a member of this ecclesia. You would have sort of this pot that everybody could tap into. And so then if somebody died, you would help pay their funerary costs, and you would probably give a stipend to the widow, and you would try to like help out, right? That existed well before Christianity. So then when Paul comes around and he starts talking about establishing ecclesia based on Christ, we think that means he's establishing his church, and we automatically think of like a steeple with like a cross on top and import everything that we think church into this. He's creating a group like the one I just described, so that you could be a member of this group who the patron deity of this group is going to be Christ. And you're going to hold things in common, pay, some kind of donation to the saints is how but you're going to like have a pool of money that everybody can tap into, and you're going to work for the public good. And that's going to be like the group that you're a part of. And you can see how much that's an easier shift from uproot your entire life and quote unquote convert to this other religion, as much as become part of this ecclesia. They're going to help you out. if you need help here, and we can sit around, we could talk about philosophy, we're going to have a fellowship meal together, right? Which they always did. They'd have dinner parties like a couple of times, like once a month or something. And so Kloppenborg went through and he documented all of these ecclesia that already existed and compared it to what you see when the Christian ecclesia start to develop. And what he determined is that there's nobody in sort of the upper echelons of Roman society or the native aristocracy that become patrons of these kind of ecclesia to the Severan period. So it takes a few hundred years. Before that, you have sort of like middle class people who are part of this movement or upper middle class, but you don't make inroads into the Roman authority or like the imperial system and for a couple of hundred years, because then it's established, it's been around a while, somebody who's super rich takes an interest and becomes a part of it. So maybe Scientology isn't a bad example, right? Like you eventually get to Tom Cruise, right? Like you eventually get Tom Cruise to sponsor it and then it infiltrates Hollywood. But maybe that happened faster than it did.
I mean, and Scientology, I think it's infectious too, because the way that they recruit people is kind of on this self-help basis. Like, we're going to help you become the most effective version of yourself. And I wanted to ask you if there's something about Christ in this. I mean, it's a very bizarre symbol if you think about it. If you try to forget everything you know about the history of the world and just imagine that you have this symbol of a guy being tortured and dying on this torture instrument as the central figure and the central image behind this movement. What is it about that is so infectious and so, makes these different clubs want to take him on as their patron deity?
I mean, if I was to venture a guess, I feel like persecution complexes are perhaps the most uniformly powerful organizing principle. We saw this during COVID. We put out this episode with a lady who she'd gotten in trouble for, talking about alternative treatments, and we put the episode
She's a
out.
doctor.
She's a physician, but she got in trouble with her board for authorizing treatments,
saying words which we shall not mention here.
Yeah, exactly. And after that episode got taken down off of YouTube when we released it, I saw very clearly how powerful persecution is as a fundraising tool and as an organizing principle. And it would have been very easy at that moment to lean heavily into, well, look at what they've done to us. Aren't you so frustrated by the way that the world does this to you too? And I was very allergic to it, and so we steered as far away from it as humanly possible. But I saw that it was a really great fundraising tactic, where it's just like we mentioned it even on a subsequent podcast, and people just spontaneously came out of the woodwork and were like, yeah, fight the good fight. And I'm like, that's crazy.
Yeah, no, and it relates to what we were talking about with martyrdom, right? Like this idea of you create that sense of us versus them. And that's a very attractive message. I think there are a few potential answers for that question. I'll say this. I have some more concrete ones, but I'll give like kind of a general view related to what you were saying, which is I mentioned this idea of like the colonizer's view of the peoples that they take over. And one thing I'm always struck by when I look at funerary art from this period, from Roman elites especially, but really it permeates all levels of society that leave behind this kind of evidence. Often in their sarcophagi, they would have depictions of like the Roman military or a related kind of mythological scene, but that it's kind of an avatar for the empire, going in and just like decimating a people, like whoever it is that they're occupying. And there's a sort of, what's the word I want to use? Like, it's almost pornographic, right? Like the violence, like there's almost
gratuitous.
It's gratuitous, but it's also like spectacle, but in a very particular way, like not just spectacle in kind of the, fluffy way that word works, but it's like a spectacle of violence that is, I think for them, obviously like an important cultural narrative, because it blows my mind that anybody would want like on their sarcophagus, which people are going to see, and like this is how you're being memorialized, literally an image of some poor like Dacian kid getting their face beaten in by a horse hoof, right? Like this is what we're talking about. like that level of violence. Or when the emperors would take over one of these territories, I mean, the perfect example for us and the most obvious is the Jewish War. When they destroyed the temple, they stole everything out of the temple and they used the money from that to build the Colosseum, right? Like the Flavian family built the Colosseum from the spoils from the Jewish temple, and they build the Arch of Titus. And they mint these coins that say Judea with an image of a woman with her hands tied behind her back to a post, like as a captive. They call it the Judea capta coin. So they would depict these territories that they took over as women. And, you know, basically, if you, I don't want to say more than that, but you can imagine like the military strategy against women in warfare, right? Like they're projecting this as their cultural image of superiority, of authority, of military might, of cultural superiority. And there had to be people who were both attracted and repulsed by that kind of imagery. So who is Jesus? He is a Galilean peasant who is, by all accounts, unfairly killed in the most gruesome way possible in the ancient world. Crucifixion was like the worst of the worst. It was usually reserved for people who had no rights at all, including enslaved persons and dogs. Like animals would be crucified.
Dogs?
Romans loved crucifying dogs.
Oh my
They would do
God.
it once a year. Yeah, I can't even go there. But this is a brutal situation, right? And they wallowed in this imagery. So what you have with Jesus is a centralized figure of the same kind of principles that we're talking about in a landscape in which that kind of, again, either attraction or repulsion to that imagery was rife everywhere, right? Because people are burying themselves with some version of that narrative of violence as kind of the defining aspect of how they understand their membership in the world. So it's not too strange to me within that ambit to imagine that, you know, this crucified figure becomes, I'll use the word avatar again, just because I think it's flexible enough to understand, like that becomes symbolic of whether you reject it or accept it, very, very symbolic of what is going on with the Romans in that time period. And then connect that with the fact that the Gospels don't appear until after that war, right? If the temple hadn't fallen, if the Jewish war hadn't happened, would we have Christianity? I don't know. But people learn about Judea, they learn more about the Jewish people, and I'm talking about from the center of the empire, from Rome, because of that war in part. So you could have someone like Paul kind of floating around, trying to create ecclesia, talking to people. It's not clear James and Peter ever left Jerusalem. That's a very localized movement. But once that war happens, a couple of things happen. One is that narrative goes again into the bloodstream of Rome. The empire learns about it. You're minting coins. Like you can't even go to the marketplace without learning about it that way, right? The Colosseum gets built. It's like going to the Super Bowl, right? Like everybody is consuming entertainment in that space. And it's the product of this particular war and the vanquishing of this people. So people are learning about it in that way. And so it obviously, you know, gets their attention in that respect. So I just think that between that and kind of a generalized interest in that region, the second thing is that anybody who wasn't killed in that conflict, who survived, usually militarily, what the Romans would do is enslave those people. So if they didn't murder you, they would enslave you. So what are you doing? You're taking Judean people from their homeland and putting them into the diaspora, putting them all around the ancient Mediterranean world as part of, again, this imperial machine, where they bring into local household stories about Judea, stories about the Galilee, stories about John the Baptist, Jesus, Theudas, right? You know, all these other charismatic figures from the first century in that generation and era right before that war, right? So what is the last thing these people remember? An era before the Romans came in and destroyed everything. So who were the central figures in that time period? People like Jesus. And so that's the other thing. If that war hadn't happened, you know, and you hadn't enslaved all those Judeans who brought those stories with them into the empire, would you have Christianity? I don't know.
It's a really interesting frame for it because it almost suggests that the Romans in the elite class had started to turn away from the historic tendencies. Because for Christianity to become popular and for the violence against the Christ figure to become the organizing principle, in some way you have to turn away from the violence of the empire. You have to orient
Right.
yourself against it. And that's interesting to come from inside the empire. It's almost like a cultural evolution where people look around and they're like, oh my God, maybe we shouldn't be
Maybe we shouldn't
embracing
be doing this.
yeah.
Right. Yeah, because the other narrative you get though is like, who's going to be the true victor, right? Because yeah, you crucified, but you made a big mistake. Like, think about how the Roman authorities are portrayed in the Gospels. They're always idiots, like Herod the Great, doesn't know like his ass from his elbow. Like he's a complete moron in the story. Like we talk about Salome and like her dance of like the seven veils. It's the words in the Gospels, and she's a little girl playing. She's not like some Jezebel dancing. So he's like tricked by a little kid, right? Or a Pilate who's like, I don't know, like whatever you want, you deal with it. Like they're bumbling idiots in this story.
Bureaucrats, really.
Yeah. And so Rome is portrayed as like complicit in their own demise, right? That's part of it too. Like they're so stupid they didn't even realize what they've done, because what's going to happen now, and this is what I wrote about in the Moon article that you were talking about, like we know Christ is up marshaling like an alien army, right? Like he's marshaling this heavenly army in like the shadow of the moon, like full of like all of these figures like semi-god, like demigods, and like the departed dead and heroes, and like all these people, or not people, but beings that are part of this heavenly realm. He's going to marshal them all together, and it's very, in my mind, I always think about Lord of the Rings when like Aragorn comes in, like with the angry dead in the boats who like come in and vanquish I don't know Lord of the Rings well enough, but whoever those people were attacking the big white castle. But like that image, when I saw that movie, I'm like, oh, that's it. Like that's what's going to happen. Like the Romans are knocking at the door of, trying to take over another territory. Well, like any minute now, Jesus is going to come down with like these beings who are so much more powerful than anything on earth. The word sometimes you see in these texts is archons. So these archons are like the evil rulers, and Jesus is going to come and just wipe them out. Like they're nothing to him. And so, yeah, we're all under this imperial authority that's like brutal and sadistic and cruel and, like can't be stopped. Like, the Roman Empire in its era, like nothing was more powerful. And so what do people look for in that kind of situation? The fissures where they can find some kind of liberation, right? Even if it's a cognitive one, right? Or some kind of association with something that goes against that dominating authority. And so I think that's what you get.
It seems significant that the Roman Empire fractured not that long after the popularization of Christianity.
It takes a few hundred years again, and that has a lot to do with, like you're thinking about, like the Goths coming in and that kind of thing. Like
just the splitting of the empire into two parts, because it's the eastern and the western part.
Oh, that okay.
And so that happens in what, 286?
I don't remember the exact date,
but like 300-ish.
Yeah, and or a little bit later perhaps, but that's where you have politically a group that, or political power, however you want to put it, that just got too big, really. Like that's basically what happens. Is it would be like saying we need to have like two presidents because we can't just have one, right? It just became
That's a good idea.
I actually, it was Benjamin Franklin's original idea. Like we were talking about Jefferson before, he wanted like a panel of three, like not just one president. He wanted like a panel of three presidents that like would kind of rotate. And anyway, I think he was onto something, but they didn't listen to him. Anyway.
Originally, it was the vice president was the person who got the second amount of votes too. I found that really shocking in the biography as well.
Yeah, Benjamin Franklin's an interesting dude, and he had a lot of interesting ideas, and I think that's one of them where I was like, did you have to? Could you give it 5 minutes? Could you just like have thought about what he was saying there? Because I think he was onto something. But yeah, I think it just got too diffuse, and I think empires that take on too much, that's when you see them fall. So
I think there's a really interesting parallel here between modern academic political culture and the role it plays in sort of criticizing the mainstream imperial elements that maybe you see in the birth of Christianity in some sense, or the creation of the Gospels, or whatever this is, because essentially your thesis is that the Gospels were written by some element of the aristocracy in Rome, because they were the educated people who were able to write and reference the forms of the past and so forth.
So you're talking about my book there, right? The thesis of my book. So one small tweak to that is that I'm not necessarily thinking about the Roman aristocracy there, although I think that that's not unreasonable because we're talking about elites of society. But what I argue in my book is that we have this tendency to associate the Gospels with everything having to do with religion. Therefore, we only picture the Gospels in the context that we were talking about before, that it must come from an oral tradition within a church where they found the one literate person to record the oral speech, or the one person who's been divinely inspired but writing for a community of Christians. It's almost always exclusively within that religious context. What I argue in my book is that that is an ahistorical reading of what's the most formative influence on the gospel writers, which I think had to have been other writers, because as you say, it was just such a limit of people who had the time, the resources to write prose literature. Because as many of us know, even if you know how to read doesn't mean you're a good writer, right? Like, to be able to be at that level, we have some estimations, the numbers vary. I've never seen a number over 20%, and that's super, super, super generous. But the number of people who could read and write in antiquity was probably, I'll be, again, super generous, maybe 11%, probably more like 4, right? Like the kind of people who could write what we read in the Gospels, we're talking about 4% of an empire that can do this.
I thought you were going to say 11 people total. But,
11 people total. No, but it's fairly rarefied. And so that's why in the book, what I say is that this is an elite class of people who are doing this, who are, in terms of, again, I'm not saying these people aren't Christian. They don't know a Christian group. Why on earth would they be interested in writing about Jesus if they weren't part of an ecclesia, right? But they're kind of writing for each other. What do you have with the Synoptic Gospels? If anybody knows anything about how we understand that composition, is that Mark is first. Matthew reads Mark and writes a different version, and Luke reads, like Mark, and does his version. And then John has totally different teachings, totally different stories. Who even knows what he's doing, right? But you have a bunch of in the canon, and there are hundreds of Gospels. But what you have over time, but what you have in the canon are writers who are kind of in competition with each other, frankly. Like, oh, Mark said this, like Matthew doesn't like exorcisms. So he reads about the exorcisms in Mark and he's like, first of all, this guy doesn't quote the Hebrew scriptures enough. He's not really getting across that Jesus is like a new Moses. So I'm going to quote the Hebrew scriptures more. And I'm going to take out these exorcisms and I'm going to put in more explanation because Mark's a little bit too vague. And then Luke looks at these two guys and he's like, there's not really a good nativity here. If you think Charlie Brown Christmas and the whole baby Jesus story, all Matthew has is a genealogy. So he's like, you really need to convey that this guy is the son of God. And what do you do to do that? Or that he's a hero figure. Like I mentioned Plutarch before, when you have a really good biography of an ancient hero or religious figure, you need to show that they had this miraculous birth and that the gods were involved and there was some kind of cosmic sign and, blah, 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 right? So that's where you get that story from. These guys are writing for each other. That, in terms of what makes it onto the page, they're more informed. What's more formative are these other writers. But to be clear about the elite part,
and also, I think my point was just that there's an element of rebelliousness towards the state's oppression, right? If they're reacting against these foreign wars and stuff, that seems like a very common thing that we see today coming from the academic world, right?
Right. So what I was leading up to is, I just want to be clear that when I say elite, though, I don't mean rich.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I made that mistake.
Yeah. No. That's all I was leading up to it, and I was too long-winded. But I want to explain what I was saying in the book, because when I talk about the elites writing, it's this rarefied group because not too many people could do it because people didn't have the education to do it. So it's a very limited number of people. But remember, I said before, this is back to Canada Moss's work for a minute, you could be a rich guy who doesn't know how to read and write, but you can enslave someone to do it for you. And so when I say that these writers are writing for each other, some of them could be enslaved. And that's what Canada has written about. And I was very clear in my book as well, famous philosopher Epictetus, he used to be enslaved. He had been freed, but he was a former slave, right? So when I say elite, I don't mean necessarily like the Roman elites. I mean culturally elite. And so that's why that works with what you're saying, right? Because who are the quote unquote elites, ivory tower, right? Like coastal
We're not rich,
elites.
that's for sure.
No, we're not rich. Exactly right. And I was careful in the book to be like, am I just describing academics? Like when I talk about these
Yeah, that's all
like,
I'm kind of circling around.
Yeah, I was aware of it. But it's also, I think, a sociological fact that this tends to happen, right? And some academics are better compensated than others. Some writers become more famous than others, and others toil in relative obscurity, probably writing brilliant things that aren't realized until after they're dead. And it's actually not exclusive to writing. It happens in any artistic field. Van Gogh, he couldn't give away his paintings. And then after he dies, he becomes famous, right? And so sometimes it's not tied to lifetime either. But I think in any of these kinds of artistic endeavors, whether it's writing or painting, music, right? Sometimes you hit, sometimes you don't. You don't necessarily know why, but these are all conversations, right? And that's what I was getting at with the Gospels. It can't just be about the religion. Of course, that's part of it, but these guys are having conversations with the literature that came before them and the literature that they're interacting with at the moment. And then it had all kinds of obviously implications for the future after they were working.
It's interesting to imagine that the person who's actually doing the act of writing is enslaved, because if they're parsing the text for the person who's then dictating to them what they should write, you can imagine that parsing of the text also comes with an interpretive quality where you have the ability to inform through the lens of your experience what it is that you deliver to this person who's then going to create the commentary that you have to write down. And as you're writing, it seems like there's also some way that you have the ability to mold the narrative a tiny bit.
That's exactly what Dr. Moss has been working on. She even has some articles about this. And again, I don't want to speak for her scholarship, and you should absolutely have her on. But one thing that I've been very impressed with is her asking that question, especially because as she describes it, a lot of these people would take dictation in shorthand and then have to go write long form, whatever they took dictation on. Well, how much do they correct or change the narrative? Or, and I can imagine if you are somebody who sees the enslaved person as an extension of you, but you can't check what they have written, right? Because you don't actually read or write. You consider yourself part of intellectual culture because you've enslaved someone to do the work for you, to put the thing on paper that you want them to put on paper. But you can't check them unless you hear from somebody like, hey, I read that you said this. Like, what's with that, right? She's done some really, really interesting work in that area. And so I think the God's Ghostwriters book just came out a couple of months ago. And so I encourage people to take a look at it because it's a radically different view of how we can imagine these things were produced, which obviously, given what I've been writing about and interested in, I think is fantastic because I want to redescribe, that history.
Yeah, I think I've actually emailed her, but if the book just came out, she was probably deep in the throes of writing, and so I imagine that it might not have landed.
Yeah, no, people should definitely go out, and it's a great book.
All right, I have one last question and then we're getting down to the end here, but Big Bang cosmology. You mentioned that in your writing as being an important part of Christianity. And a lot of people don't realize this, but even the modern theory of Big Bang cosmology was essentially created by a Belgian priest. And so it has this, it's the cosmic mythology of our times, essentially, even in the secular world at this point.
Mm-hmm.
How did this work its way into Christianity? Do you have any sense of that?
Yes, and I think I won't be surprised if you tell me that the reasons it's made its way into the sciences are the same reasons I'm about to describe, which I use it to talk about how people have traditionally imagined the advent and growth of Christianity. So Jesus came and poof, like, this expansive movement that all of a sudden explodes out, is cohesive, coherent, widespread, and institutionalized almost automatically and just continues to spread out, right? But that all of those elements that you need, all of those pieces that you need to understand how Christianity 2,000 years later came into place, you get at that one origin moment. And I am somebody who is highly suspicious of origins. I think that language is incredibly problematic and oversimplifies a lot of things, and can also be guilty of narrativizing a particular kind of history that ends up having all kinds of interpretive problems that sometimes we are blind to in our historical moment. And so, what I say in the book is that we have this mythology of the Big Bang of Christianity, that Jesus comes and then boom. And it takes away any of the complexity of the things we've been talking about. Paul institutionalizing some kind of ecclesia, or offering some kind of membership into an ecclesia, a pre-existent kind of institutional structure that he then, co-opts in a certain way to give a different sort of offering to these people he's talking to. The Gospels being written as a response, perhaps to empire or something else, right? But we have lots of ways that we can have conversations or imagine what is the impetus for this kind of writing, but then that writing going out into the world, and maybe that's how somebody finds out about this Jesus figure, or maybe they've enslaved somebody from Judea, right? And they become curious about this Judean stuff and they want to know more, and they encounter, right? There are so many different models for how this kind of thing can happen that don't involve that linear Jesus to disciples to Paul to gospel writer. Because even to have the gospels that we have within the canon, within the Bible, I briefly mentioned we have hundreds of them. We do. 4 made it because there are 4 winds. Right? Like, when you look into the rationale for how some of these things take, like the canon as we have it, that doesn't get established till like the 4th century or later. There were all kinds of texts that floated around in the New Testament that eventually people are like, too late, too weird, I think it's fake. Like, these things are not as self-evident, I think, as our histories sometimes try to smooth over the rough patches. And I have a great sympathy for that because, just to draw a modern analogy, like, look at what we as like Americans have been through in the last like 6 weeks, right? Like, we're bombarded with all this election stuff. You have like one guy who's almost assassinated, and then another guy who drops out, and then now, this whole narrative around Kamala Harris, right? I don't want to get political, but you see what I mean, right? Like, how many of us have really metabolized exactly what is going on? And it always stands out to me too when some of these figures from like 30 years ago like come out of the woodwork. Like, I haven't seen Bill Clinton in 10,000 years, right?
I was looking at pictures of him actually, and I was like, I don't even recognize this face.
I was going through a midlife crisis because I remember in 5th grade, like, that election was going on and they were showing us all the candidates. And I remember seeing him being like, he's too young. Like, he doesn't even have any gray hair. And now I see this guy and I'm like, oh my God, how old am I? Like, I remember the first time I saw this dude. But that's what I mean. Like, and then you're reminded, like, you hear his voice or something, and then you're reminded, like, oh yeah, the 90s, man, that was weird, right? We take time to look back at history to try to understand and interpret what has happened, and we lose a lot, right? Some narratives rise to the top for a variety of different, social reasons. Others don't. We forget some people. I love TikTok, and I'm always amused by like the nostalgia for the 80s and 90s on TikTok. And they'll be like, remember that moment in the 90s when everybody was really into like Gregorian chant music to like techno? And I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. Like, do you remember like that one album that like people, but like, I forgot about that, but like, there's a narrative that comes back up that had been completely lost. I know that's a silly example, but I hope you can go along with me in what I mean.
Well, I think there's something very.
It just takes a while.
I think the success of the Big Bang narratives in science and perhaps in everything else comes down to its self-similarity with our own lives and the way that you develop as a person, where you start off and you're just born and boom, and then you just form into something, and it has this linear trajectory to it, and eventually it dies. I mean, at the simplest form, the story that we tell of the universe, even in science, is very self-reflective of our own individual stories, in which
I love that. Yeah. That's a really great way to put it, because we don't remember every day, right? We just remember these little pockets. But that's why when you ask me, like, how'd you get into this? I'm like, I want to be really careful, because I'm going to narrativize a chronology here that I don't know. Like, this is my best guess of how this happened. And that's kind of what I've tried to provide with Christianity. But what I know is that it wasn't that easy. And day to day is not that easy, and people are not that easy. People are complicated and messy and faulty. And so sometimes, just to kind of bookend this, you were asking me earlier, how did we get this vision of, the gospel writers as writing the word of God, or, being definitive texts that are, not to be questioned, right? Like, how did the critical study come up? I think a little bit of that comes from, wanting to have something to rely on, or something a little bit more secure than I think that we can provide one another as human beings, because we have to remember all of this is filtered through human beings. So even if it's difficult to hear that the gospel writers maybe aren't writing down the word for word, teachings of Jesus, maybe some of them are his teachings. Can I tell you which ones are and which ones aren't? There are groups like the Jesus Seminar that have tried to do this. Their methodologies have a lot of problems because people have a lot of problems, right? And so I try to just boil things down to what are the most essential, helpful messages, I think, from anything coming out of Christianity or the New Testament or the letters of Paul or the Gospels. And that is, try to be kind, try to help. Yeah, try to help, try to be patient. Try to be supportive. And if you see people in need, try to address it, because life is hard enough. And so at the end of the day, I hope that's the message most people carry forward from.
Yeah, and I think it's funny because I read science headlines every morning just for kicks, just to see what's popular. And you see these headlines cropping up now in studies, study finds that the quickest way to alleviate depression is to help other people, or people who have strong social relationships, people who are kind to one another, end up not developing Alzheimer's at the same rate. Like, it's this hilarious clinicalization of these age-old wisdoms, which are sort of self-evident at the same time. So I feel like we're in some sense going through another religious cultural transformation, which is, again, resurrecting these old ideas in some form that's more palatable to our, rational civilization.
I completely agree. No, I completely agree. And that's why I think it's helpful to think about, like, Paul is just trying to do science too. He's just, we've lost some of that, but I don't think it's, I think it helps to think about it in those terms, because we're doing the same thing. And so once we recognize that we have these patterns, then, maybe we can do something more productive with them. But I completely agree with you.
Yeah. Cheers to scholarship. All right, Robyn, thank you so much. It's been really fun to talk to you. And
thank you so much.
Yeah, I feel like I have so much to digest now. I'm going to go and think about all these things for a while.
Well, let me know if I can help clarify anything else, but also thank you for your time. And this has really been a delight.
Yeah, thanks for the recommendations of people to follow up on. We will look into that and hopefully open our minds even further. But have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Yep,
Bye.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.